Alright, this is Mr. Gillum, and today we're going to be finding given percent of a whole number. We've talked about percents just a little in the past, but I want to just remind you of a few important things. Percent is the amount per 100. It's per cent, and I remember that because cent is a type of currency. There's 100 cents in $1. Alright, and we've switched percents to decimals before. So if I were thinking of something like 12%, I would know that I'm talking about 12 parts out of 100. Or I could say 12 per 100. I also know, though, that I'm dividing by 100. That's what this fraction bar means. And so we talked and we made a chart that, okay, 2 times 100 is 200. And we noticed that, oh, you moved the decimal place 2 spots. Well, it works the same way when we are dividing by 100. So if I had 12 divided by 100, instead of making it bigger 2 decimal places, I would make it smaller 2 decimal places. And so that would be 0.12. And so we've written percents as fractions per 100 and as decimals by moving the decimal place 2 spots. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use some of the keywords that we know to help us figure out what 50% of 16 is. Now some of you probably realize right away that 50% is the same as half, and so this would probably be a mental math problem for you because you know that half of 16 is 8. But for some of us, that's not the case. We maybe don't realize that 50% is 1/2. And so what I want to think about is this: look for these keywords. If I'm finding 50% of 16, I know this very important word here in the middle, of, means multiply. So if I multiply 50% times 16, I could do this several ways. I could say 50 out of 100 times 16, or I could say 0.50 times 16. All right, 50 out of 100, if I reduce, cross reduce, I see that that would be 8. If I take my calculator and I multiply 0.5 times 16, that will also be 8. Okay, and so there's 2 ways to do it. If you're changing your percent into a fraction per 100, multiply by reducing, cross reducing, and multiplying straight across. If you're changing it into a decimal, we probably shouldn't be using calculators for this, but 16 times 0.5 would be 0.38, and we have 1 decimal, so I'm going to move it, 8.0, otherwise known as 8. Okay, so let's do the second one here again, both ways. It says find 20% of 30, and I want to really emphasize this word of because we're going to be using it a lot. That means multiply. So I'm really taking 20% times 30. Well, let's figure this out here. 20% is 20 per 100. If I multiply that by 30, we'll see what happens. I see that 10 can go into 20 twice and into 100 10 times. 1 and 5, and then finally 5 and 6 multiply, and I get the answer of 6. 6 is 20% of 30. Or what I could do is I could change 20%, move that decimal place 2 spots because that's what I'm doing when I'm dividing by 100, and I could just say that 0.2, and you know, when I do that, it looks like 0.20, but this 0 is insignificant, so I can just write 0.2 times 30. And again, when I multiply, I would get 6. Okay, so there's 2 ways that we can do these. Let's find 80% of 40. So again, it's very important to know that this of, the word of, means multiply. So I'm thinking 80% of 40. I can do it 2 ways. I can say, okay, I have 80 100ths times 40. Let's do it that way first. 80% is 80 per 100. So that's why I can change it to 80 out of 100. And I can reduce. 10 goes into 80 8 times and into 100 10 times. 8 and 10 both share a 2 in common. And 5 and 40 both share a 5 in common. And so when I multiply straight across, 4 times 8 is 32, and 1 times 1 is 1. I'm not going to write that on the bottom. So I believe that 32 is 80% of 40. Let's see if it works the same way with the decimals. When I think about 80%, that's per 100. So if I divide by 100, I can move the decimal place 2 spots to give me 0.80. But really, that 0 on the end is not significant because there's no numbers behind the 0. So I'm just going to say 0.8 times 40. When I multiply 0.8 times 40, your calculator might say 32, it might say 32.0, but again, the 0.0 is really not important unless there's numbers behind the 0. So in this case, you would also get 32. All right? Let's take a look at the next one here. And again, I'm just trying to find 15% of 200. That word of is very important, especially for tomorrow. So we need to remember that means multiply. 15% times 200. And so I can think of 15% in two different ways. I can think of it as 15 100ths, because percent means per 100, and multiply like that. And let's go ahead and solve this one first. And you know, I like to reduce, cross reduce, so that's what I'm going to do. I know that 5 goes into 15 3 times and into 100 20 times. I also know that 20 goes into 20 once and into 200 10 times. And so when I multiply 3 times 10, that gives me 30, and 1 times 1 is 1. And I don't need to write the 1 on the bottom of the 30 because that 30 divided by 1 is still 30. If I thought about it as a decimal, I can move that decimal place 2 spots by dividing by 100. And so I would have 0.15 times 200. When I multiply, again, what I would get is 30. So 0.15 times 200 is 30 as well. So you can think of the percents as two different ways. You can think of them as a fraction or as a decimal. Let's just do two more. And it says find 125% of 48. Okay, and so even though that the percent is greater than 100%, that's okay. We're not going to change our method here. 125% times 48. So that really means 125 out of 100% per 100 times 48. And let's try to go ahead and solve that one first. I know that 25 goes into 125 5 times and into 100 4 times. And if I cross reduce 4 and 48, I get 1 and 12. 5 times 12 is 60. So I think that 60 would be 125% of 48. That would make sense that 60 is bigger than 48 because 125% is more than a whole. So that answer does make sense. I could also think of it as 125% as a decimal. And when I talking about percent, I'm talking about per 100, so I'm dividing by 100. I can take 1.25 times 48. And again, if you did that with your calculator, you would get 60. Okay? Let's just do one more here. Find 140% of 16. Now, I kind of said this a little earlier, but I want to say it again. 140%, that's more than a whole. So my number that I calculate should be bigger than 16 because 100% would be 16. 140 would be 16 plus another 40% on top of that. So let's just take a look here. If I'm looking for 140% of 16 multiply, then I can think of it as 140 per 100 times 16. I know that 10 goes into 110 times and into 140 14 times. I notice that these are both even numbers, so 2 must go into both of them. And in this case, I don't have anything to cross-reduce. And so this would be a little more appropriate to do with a calculator probably. 7 times 16 is 112 over 5 times 1 is 5. 112 over 5. Or, if I divided 112 by 5, I would get 22.4. And that would be the best and most appropriate answer for a percent. Oh, not for percent, for the number. We don't usually use fractions when we're talking with percents or percents of a whole. We almost always use whole numbers. So 22.4. Now, on all the other examples, we can cross-reduce and there would be nothing left on the bottom. If you do get to an example where you're using a fraction and you get an answer like this, if you type in your calculator 112 divided by 5, that will get you the 22.4 that you were looking for. Okay, I could also think of the 140 right off the bat as a decimal, 1.4. And if I take 1.4 times 16, that would also give me 22.4. Okay, so we can think of them as fractions, we can think of them as decimals. Those percents can be represented multiple ways, but the really important part today is to remember that the word of, when we're finding a percent of another number, means we're going to multiply. All right, so that's it for today. I'll see you in class tomorrow.